Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Alma College in Michigan. And I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's from ancient Greece, India, China, the Near East, or beyond. And in today's episode, we're covering the system of marriage lotteries that Plato develops in the Republic. Specifically, this is coming from the fifth book of the Republic. Plato's Republic is probably known for a bunch of different things. Perhaps most of all, among non specialists, is the allegory of the cave, which we've covered before in a previous episode. Among specialists in ancient philosophy, the Republic's probably well known for a great number of things. Perhaps, um, perhaps the most well known things are the theory of the divided soul, the form of the good, and the claim that philosophers should be the rulers in the ideal city. Among these topics, Plato develops some important doctrines in social and political philosophy. The claim, for instance, that philosophers are the rulers in the ideal city is one such controversial claim. One of the most controversial and interesting, for lack of a better word, interesting parts of the Republic is this discussion in the middle of Book 5 about this marriage lottery system that Plato creates. Specifically, Plato compares the rearing of human beings to the rearing of animals. And the idea is that just as we breed animals very selectively to ensure that we have the best possible offspring for our flock of sheep or so whatever particular kind of animal we're raising. Just as we do that for animals, we should also do that for human beings. So yes, Plato is really suggesting and really argues that we need to create a system for arranged marriages for the purposes of what people would in the 20th century call eugenics, meaning that we want to basically ensure the direction of the species goes in one particular way. For Plato, it's not like at a species level, but he wants to ensure that offspring in the ideal state are ideal. So we need to take the best men and the best women and breed them together. We're also going to breed together the worst men and the worst women, but we'll talk about what happens to those offspring when we get there. Let's just say a little bit more about this idea at a general level. So, at in its most basic form, Plato is arguing for arranging marriages. At its most basic form, Plato is arguing for arranging marriages, and in order to ensure offspring are really, really good. There is a discussion to be had about the arranged marriages of the inferior people. It's not like those people are going to be locked out of having children or reproducing, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Let's just make it easy for ourselves right now, talking about breeding the best with the best. The idea, simply put, is that we're going to try to ensure the next generation of the ideal city is really, really good. And then we're going to try to maintain that optimum level of quality or optimal level of quality. We're going to try to maintain that in perpetuity. We can't have people getting mad at the rulers for the marriages they arrange. It just wouldn't, it would lead to too much social strife and social division for the people to say, well, I want to have children with that person over there. You give me pick of my mate. Or I don't have chemistry with that person. I don't want to mate with that person. You should put me with this other person. Right? If you take that freedom out of people's hands to choose their own mates, they're going to be mad at least some of the time and perhaps quite a lot of the time with what the picks are, even if the rulers are very, very, very good at their job of ensuring the right offspring, that doesn't mean that the marriages are going to be happy. That doesn't mean that people are going to get the outcomes that they want. Okay. So we need a system that's going to ensure that people can't blame the rulers. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually make marriages um, be arranged but not appear to be arranged. Again, we're going to make marriages be arranged but not appear to be arranged. So we're going to actually make marriages seem random, but they're not really going to be random. Now, we can't leave this up to random chance, just like we can't leave it up to people's, natural feeling of chemistry or attraction, that they're not chance and natural feelings of attraction are not going to be particularly great guides to reliably producing the generation of human beings that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to arrange marriages but try to make them seem not arranged. So we're going to implement a lottery system. And Plato's not clear about like what exactly the mechanics of the lottery are going to be, but it would be easy enough for us to imagine that like there is some kind of festival attached to this. So it's going to be sort of like a dressed up religious festival, and people might, do something that's the equivalent of, pulling a name out of a hat. But it's actually arranged which name you pull out. You just don't know that it's arranged. The Greeks did actually have a kind of slot machine like thing with which they did voting or elections. They're not true elections or true voting because they're random, but when the Greeks talk about electing someone by lot, that someone gets appointed to some political position by lot, they're actually referring to a kind of slot machine like system that would yield electoral results randomly. Plato perhaps might have something like that in mind, but clearly has got to be arranged for this to work out. Because the marriages are arranged but don't appear to be arranged, this is all going to be built on a clever lie. And Plato, a lot in his social and political philosophy, especially in the part of Republic 5 that I have in mind, but earlier in the Republic 2, introduces this idea of a noble lie. The rulers should not be honest with the citizenry. Not only do the rulers not have an obligation to be honest, but actually they have an obligation to be dishonest. Again, not only is there no obligation to tell the truth, but actually doing a good job and doing right by your city means withholding the truth and outright lying. For example, you have to tell a lie that's like, this marriage was random. It wasn't really, but we're going to tell you it was. Plato, when he introduces the noble lie, both initially earlier in the Republic and again here in Republic 5, compares it to um, the administration of a drug, that a noble lie has to be administered like a drug. What he means by that is that drugs need to be dosed expertly in order to be efficacious. And also they cannot be dangerous either. You want to do at least the minimum effective dose, but you also don't want to go over the maximum tolerable dose. So you need to have this fine line. Okay, like when am I going to tell this lie? What's the lie I'm going to tell? How am I going to break it to this person? Everything needs to be expertly crafted. And that's what makes the lie noble, is that it's in a way appropriate, masterful, it's commendable, admirable. It's not one of those detestable lies that are told for some self-destructive reason or harmfully. This is a lie that's aimed at the good outcomes for the city. Aimed at the good outcomes for the city. What character traits are we trying to breed into people? I mean, that's a question that I think is pretty natural to ask. Like, what exactly are we trying to do? Well, like, Plato doesn't have like a real sophisticated notion of inheritance. Of course, the Greeks are aware of, at a very basic level, of the fact that, children look like their parents. So, and that's something that Greeks generally try to explain in their embryological theories. But that doesn't mean they have any true, deep understanding of inheritance, especially not Plato, who has only a very sketchy theory of reproduction at the end of the Timaeus. But that there's certainly, even putting aside a full understanding of inheritance as such, the Greeks definitely don't understand genetics. But there is a sense that at some basic level, you can inherit character traits from your parents. These character traits come in general packages, like in the Plato's dialogue, the statements, the relevant character traits are something like boldness and gentleness, and you can actually weave together the correct proportions of these things by pairing people together in the right way. And then you get offspring that have the right character traits in the right proportion. And that's surely what Plato has in mind here, too, is some kind of understanding of the way that we can basically engineer the next generation of human beings to have the right sort of natures we want. We want them to have the right natures because these people are ultimately going to fulfill very important social roles. Everyone in the ideal city for Plato has an important role to play, whether that means that they're an artisan or they are a carpenter or a soldier or a ruler or something like that. Everyone has a different role to play. Now, it does look like Plato in Republic 5 is restricting the marriage lottery system to people who are not in the artisan, merchant, laborer factions of the city. That Plato is not talking about those people. So he's talking probably principally about the soldiers and the would-be rulers. So there's a difficult question about whether that's actually true. So, for example, at Republic 5 460c, Plato confirms that this whole system is important if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure, end quote. So again, that's a quotation from 460c. This is important if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure, end quote. The guardian breed refers to the faction of the city that's not concerned with laboring or mercantile activities and so on. At this point in the Republic, Plato hasn't precisely distinguished between the soldiers and the rulers, but the term guardian is being used pretty generally to capture both of those things. Now, of course, Plato might not mean that this is supposed to apply only to the so-called guardians, the class of would-be rulers and soldiers. After all, saying that this is important if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure, that's not incompatible with it applying more widely. And after all, we might have independent reason for wanting to ensure our merchants have such and such character traits, right? To be not too debauched or something like that. And so the same reasoning could apply generally. But when you consider that this is occurring in a part of the Republic that's deeply concerned with social policies, restricting the activities of the guardians, and that Plato does say this is important if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure. I mean, again, you can sort of see the argument on either side, and I just don't think it's that important to Plato to answer the question, which factions of the city for which is this actually important? The crucial thing, though, is that there is this a lottery system in place that's based on a lie, a noble lie, because it's well told. It has to be well told because it's being directed at achieving a certain social aim, which is the propagation of the right sorts of character traits. And again, these character traits are going to be very general things like, is your nature such that you're a fast learner or something, that you have a good memory, because those are going to be the traits that we want to breed into our would-be rulers. And so we're not going to try to squander the gift of any particular man or woman in this respect by letting them breed with someone who's inferior and who could ruin this gift. At the very least, we have to preserve the good thing we've got And who knows, maybe breeding the right sorts of people together will ensure that these gifts are actually emphasized or exaggerated in the next generation. So there are a few details that we should go over. One detail is that this is all going to be dressed up as a religious ceremony. So I'll read off this passage. This is from Republic 5, 459E to 460A, starting the quotation now. Therefore, certain festivals and sacrifices will be established by law, at which we'll bring together the brides and grooms and will direct our poets to compose appropriate hymns for the marriages that take place. We'll leave the number of marriages for the rulers to decide, but their aim will be to keep the number of males as stable as they can, taking into account war, disease, and similar factors, so that the city will, as far as possible, become neither too big nor too small. And then Socrates' interlocutor Glaucon replies, "That's right." And then Socrates says, then there will have to be some sophisticated lotteries introduced so that at each marriage, the inferior people we mentioned will blame luck rather than the rulers when they aren't chosen. End quote. So, what Plato is depicting in this conversation between Socrates and Glaucon is he's now introducing another reason. We get the same reason we've heard before about the guardian breed needs to remain pure. That's captured in this point about the inferior people not being chosen and needing to blame luck because they mistakenly believe that this is a lottery, a fair lottery, when in fact it's rigged. But then there's also this fact about we need to maintain the population of males as stably as possible, keeping into account war, disease, and similar factors. And all of this is being dressed up as a religious festival at which poets will be composing appropriate hymns. So this is all dressed up as a religious festival. The next detail we should discuss concerns the ages of the people involved. Plato is very clear that when people leave behind the prime child making years of their lives, they ultimately can engage in sex with anyone they want. The ages that Plato believes are off limits are a woman's prime, which Plato says lasts about 20 years. That's about, in his view, in Republic 5, that's from age 20 to age 40. And then for men, men have a prime of about 30 years. And Plato gives the upper range is 55 and the lower end of the range as the time at which he passes his peak as a runner. And it's just supposed to be inferred, I suppose, from that that's 25, I mean, because Plato says that men's prime lasts about 30 years and ends at age 55. So really, we're supposed to think men begin to peak around 25 and maintain that peak for the next 30 years. But Plato doesn't really mind if people outside of that range have sex whenever they want. The other with anyone they want. But there is another factor related to age, which is that when men are young and they're good. So these are the men who are good in whatever respect we want. For example, have a good nature or good in war is an example Plato gives at 460A to B. This is what he says. Among other prizes and rewards, the young men who are good in war or other things must be given permission to have sex with the women more often, since this will also be a good pretext for having them father as many of the children as possible. End quote. So what that is revealing to us when we take the point I just made about older people, now we have this claim about what young men in their prime will be encouraged to do. We get the impression that Plato's not just controlling marriages and controlling offspring, but he's actually controlling the frequency with which people have sex in general. Plato's actually imagined this as a control on people's sex lives. That's apparent from the fact that Plato's talking about how sex is a reward for these good men. And we're going to say, have sex with the women more often, is what the text says. And then that becomes a pretext for fathering more children. Clearly, then, the actual rate at which even the best men are having sex with the best women is determined by the state or the rulers. And again, this is all, as he says, a good pretext for having him father as many of the children as possible. Now, the third detail we should consider is what happens to the inferior men and the inferior women. They're paired together too. They're not paired together because we actually want their children, though. It's not obvious why we bother to pair them together at all, except insofar as doing so helps us maintain the ruse of the marriage lottery system. After all, it wouldn't make sense really to have a marriage lottery system where we just like only pair together the best people and we literally leave the the inferior people unwed and unmarried and presumably unhappy, especially if we're controlling people's sex lives here. Well, Plato says that these children simply shouldn't be raised at all. So I'm reading now from Republic 5, 460 B to C. I think they'll take the children of good parents to the nurses in charge of the rearing pen, situated in a separate part of the city. But the children of inferior parents, or any child of the others that is born defective, they'll hide in a secret and unknown place as is appropriate. And then Glaucon affirms, yeah, if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure, that's necessary. End quote. So that's the end of that passage is where we got this quotation from earlier about the guardian breed needing to remain pure. But the idea is that the good children, we take away the good children from the parents who are good and desirable, and we give them to nurses who are in charge of a rearing pen situated in another part of the city. But the children of the inferior parents, we're going to take them away and hide them in a secret and unknown place. And we're also going to do so to any child who's born to anyone who's just born defective. So very, very, very deformed is what Plato means by that. So what does that mean, secret and unknown place? Well, it seems that Plato means that these children are going to be exposed. The idea of exposure, which is a technical term when we're talking about the ancient world, I don't expect all of you to know what I mean by exposure. But exposure is basically when children were born and just left outside to die. It was a way of basically rejecting children from the family. Why you might want to expose a child varies from case to case. There are a couple of different reasons. In general, Greek culture, the idea was that in some way the kid was going to be a burden. You could imagine that most easily in cases of great deformities, which certainly is what Plato has in mind. Obviously, everything I'm saying now is just incredibly cruel by modern standards. Even talking about this is heinous by modern standards. In the ancient world, it was just a thing done. Plato deeply encourages it and believes it's important for the health of the city. Plato encourages it so much, we're also going to do it for children who are born healthy. And we're going to do it because their parents don't have the right natures. And we kind of want to breed out those qualities in those types of people. There are other reasons too why someone in Greek culture might want to do this. Probably the most famous instance of exposure is in the play Oedipus by Sophocles. The idea is that Oedipus had this prophecy that he was going to do a bunch of terrible things like kill his own father. So his household exposed him, but ultimately he was saved by someone. And the point is that even just, Oedipus was born healthily, but he was born a healthy baby, but he had this prophecy attached to him. So even doesn't even I suppose Oedipus in the play was a burden in a deeper sense that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother and have children with his mother. So like that's That's a very, very special case of this. But the sense here is that exposure happens when in at some level the child is being deemed a burden. Plato's word here is defective in the Republic, but then also there's just a sense that these kids are going to have the wrong natures. They're going to keep the guardian breed impure or make the guardian breed impure. So that's a kind of burden here. There's a fourth detail will be what happens to people who have sex against the rules. Plato says at 461a, we'll say that his offense is neither pious nor just. For the child he begets for the city, if it remains hidden, will be born in darkness through a dangerous weakness of will, and without the benefit of the sacrifices and prayers offered at every marriage festival, in which the priests and priestesses, together with the entire city, ask that the children of good and beneficial parents may always prove themselves still better and more beneficial. And then Glaucon replies, that's right. And Socrates says, the same law will apply if a man of still of begetting years has a child with a woman of childbearing age without the sanction of the rulers. Will say that he brings to the city an illegitimate, unauthorized, and unhallowed child. So the crucial point here is that Plato's basically saying, like, the fact that we've dressed this up as a religious festival helps us deny something that would be culturally and socially important and sought after for people who break the rules. In other words, we're going to deny people the important social sanction that comes from the religiosity of this festival so that we're not going to offer sacrifices and prayer. We're also not going to recognize this child as someone authorized and unhallowed. And of course, ultimately, the idea is that this child will be put in the quote unquote secret and unknown place, which can only really realistically mean exposed and killed. The fifth detail concerns something that I'm actually not really going to talk about in this episode. I'm just going to flag, which is that this is very, very tied to the fact that Plato doesn't believe in maintaining the institution of the family. Yes, Plato believes in the abolition of the family. He believes that children should be raised communally. There are so many different reasons for that. So many different reasons for that. And we're not going to be able to cover this idea fully, but like this is an important part of Plato's social views that the family as an institution just will not stick around in the ideal city, at least for the guardians. And again, it's not really obvious how much applies to the other faction, the faction composed of laborers and merchants and so on. I think the same sort of reasoning should hold for them, but it's just never explicitly extended to the other faction, the faction composed of laborers. This is going to be the guardians, i.e., just the soldiers and would-be rulers. The reasoning in brief is perhaps twofold, but I'm simplifying this issue. The first reason is that ultimately women are going to be doing all sorts of jobs. They're going to be rulers, they're going to be soldiers, they're going to be laborers and carpenters and merchants and so on. Women are, as a rule, not going to be in the household looking after children because they're going to be doing other things. Their time will be spent serving the city and the state just as much as other people. Plato believes in the equality of men and women, at least when it comes to doing jobs, even ruling. That's not to say Plato believes that women are in every sense full human beings. He's very clear about that in the Timaeus, for example. But women do have, from a social point of view, a huge amount of equality. Again, even being able to rule the ideal city and do philosophy. For that reason, women just aren't going to stick around in the household being mothers. The second important reason is that everyone in the city is going to do the job that they're best at. They're going to specialize in the one and only job that they're best at. We're not going to let people do the job that they want to do. We're not going to let people multitask. We're going to specialize people. a huge part of the Republic here that I'm passing over quickly. But the fact remains that this is important for understanding this detail of the marriage lottery system, which is that since everyone's going to be doing their own job, we're going to let people who specialize in parenting and child raising raise children and parent. We're going to let the specialists handle it, just like we're going to let the specialist soldiers handle soldiering and the specialist rulers rule and the specialist carpenter. We're going to let people do the one job that they're actually good at and fully specialize. We're not going to let people dabble and be dilettantes, whether that's in carpentry or ruling or soldiering or even parenting. And when Plato talks about bringing the children of good parents to the nurses in charge of the rearing pen, situated in a separate part of the city, as indeed he does at 460 B to C, Plato is alluding to this part of his view. Though that I think concerns the unpacking of this view in the Republic. It remains to us for what's left in this episode to say, what the heck? This is such a weird part of Plato's Republic. And the idea of it grosses people out. The most natural objection is, what about people's rights? What about people's autonomy? By autonomy, I just mean something like their capacity for self-determination and planning their lives in a way that compels us to respect those plans. That's what I mean by autonomy. The right to self-determine and plan and come up with plans for your lives in a way for their lives in a way that compels us to respect those plans. What about people's autonomy and people's rights? Well, there are a couple answers to this objection. The first is the most obvious, but perhaps the most unsatisfying, which is that this whole idea of rights and autonomy is something super. This idea is something super anachronistic. It just comes later. Plato's not going to handle that objection because he just doesn't have it on his radar. But it is something we can ask. Well, what would Plato say about that? People have a right to form marriages and have kids and control their own sex lives. To be sure, Plato does think that you have that right to some degree. Like, you can wait until you're at the right age to have sex with anyone you want. But even then, like, the whole reason is that we're letting you do that because for 20 years for women and 30 years for men, you specifically weren't allowed to have the kids you wanted to have. So like we allow some people the right to have sex with anyone they want when they get old enough. But that's just another way of restating for a huge chunk of your adult life. You don't have control over those things. And you never get any say over who your kids will be and which person you have kids with. So I suspect that everyone who reads Plato's Republic walks out with a different understanding of this idea and has a different response to this objection. I'll present the responses to this objection that I imagine for the sake of teaching students. So when students get to this point in the lecture and they're super wide-eyed and they're surprised and they're shocked that someone holds this view, all of which are very normal, natural reactions. It'd be weird if you didn't feel that way. But still, I mean, we should have an answer to this. Well, like, how do we make sense of Plato's view here? Well, the way I make sense of it to my students is I ask them to imagine something like this. Imagine that you're carpooling with two other people. Let's say you're carpooling with me and a third person, Jolene, let's call her. You, Jolene, and I are carpooling. We have this carpool to get from our houses to work every morning. We meet at a parking lot just by our house, and we drive together to work. And it saves us gas, it saves us mileage on our car, and it makes our lives easier, and so on. And one day you say something like, you know what, I think we should get out of the car and unscrew one of the wheels. Like take off one of the wheels and go to do the carpool without the fourth wheel. We'd look at you like you were crazy. Now, you could say, well, look, this is my right. I want this. This is my plan for my life. I want to have a carpool with only three wheels. And we would say, how can you do that? You'd be harming us in the process. You'd be screwing over our carpool. Not only that, you'd be going against the whole purpose of the carpool. The carpool is to get us from point A to point B, all of us from point A to point B efficiently, effectively, competently. We might not get there at all by your standards. And if so, and even if we do, it would be a bumpy ride. Now, that's all true, but you could still say, well, this is my right. I'm entitled to this. You have to respect it. Plato thinks that your claim to be able to marry and have sex and have as many and have all the children you want with anyone you want. So you'd be violating the fact that we want to keep the guardian breed pure. We also want to keep the number of people in the city stable, especially the number of men given war and disease and so on. And you'd be violating all these things. You'd be doing so by saying it's your right. But the fact is that your insistence that you have such a right is your insistence that you have such a right is just as destructive of the whole city as your insistence that you have the right to take off the wheel. It's just in the carpooling example, um even it's just very drastic because of the extremeness of the step you're taking. To us, the idea of having the children we want is very obvious and natural and intuitive. But Plato doesn't see it that way after Plato views this as an incredibly important thing to avoid. So we have to sort of put ourselves in Plato's shoes. But Plato believes that one, you're harming other people by you're threatening the integrity of the city, right? Just as you're threatening the integrity of the car and the possibility of getting our carpool, but you're also of getting our carpool to work. I mean, but you're also violating the whole point. Um, you're harming us, and but you're also defeating the whole purpose of the city, because the whole point of the city, Plato thinks, is something like to maintain our well-being, to satisfy the needs of each person, to keep us safe, and so on. Especially, Plato thinks that it has to do with the satisfaction of basic needs. All of that gets thrown under the bus because you insist you have this right. You insist you have this right. Plato's reasoning in this part of his philosophy tends to boil down to the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means, and that means that this lottery system is justified by the important aim it promotes. Obviously, we can doubt that this is in fact necessary for this aim. We might think to ourselves that, well, we have functioning societies, and and we don't control marriages. Plato might doubt that our societies are functioning in the way he wants them to be functioning, though. No doubt he has that option available to him. But more to the point, I mean, Plato's just approaching this from a completely different point of view, completely different cultural framework. The other possible idea is that we have rights, even if things go badly as a result of our rights, even if our rights produce bad outcomes or lead to unwanted consequences, that we still have these rights. Certainly, Plato would disagree very profoundly with that idea. The idea that our right to marry is God given is something that Plato would never maintain. Um, uh, Again, trying to figure out why he would not maintain that, what would his objections be, that's difficult because it's all so anachronistic to imagine this stuff. It's so we're approaching it from our point of view and projecting points of view back on Plato and imagining his replies. But for Plato, it's true that humans are made by God, by the gods. There's a major god, the demiurge, but there's also these assistant gods who help make our bodies. The fact that we're made by God doesn't do very much for Plato in terms of moral significance in this respect. It doesn't mean we have God given rights or dignity. Toads are made by God too. Mountains are made by God. That doesn't mean they're special. Everything is made by God or the gods for Plato. I don't expect anyone to be convinced by this defense here. The idea that we should carefully control um, marriages and sex and reproduction. Obviously, that's not to say it hasn't been tried in human history. We can think of forced sterilization programs, eugenics programs. They might not be as lofty as Plato makes it sound. They're in fact usually very heinous and egregious. And for all I know, we might say the same thing about Plato's views. But but for Plato, the idea is something lofty and noble, whereas a lot of these eugenics programs are incredibly morally shameful and real blemishes on human history. Plato's Republic is much more of a historical curiosity in this respect. Even though the reasoning might be familiar to us from very dark chapters in human history. Again, I don't expect anyone to be convinced by this, and truthfully, how we imagine Plato responding to the rights-based insistence on autonomy focused arguments for controlling our own sex lives and marriages and reproductive futures. All like however we might construe that those objections and Plato's replies to those objections, ultimately that is speculation on the part of a historian or on the part of an educator. The most we can do is try to reconstruct Plato's own views, and I do think that my replies are fairly good as far as speculation or conjecture goes about how Plato might reply. Certainly, that's the way I explain it to undergraduate students. Either way, I think this concludes our look at this interesting part of Plato's social and political philosophy. Certainly, in future episodes, we'll come back to the idea of the abolition of the family, the political and social equality of men and women, the idea that everyone in the city has a specialized role that they perform, and only one of those roles. We'll come back to all of these ideas in future episodes, but this suffices, I think, for now. If you're interested in subscribing to the podcast, you can do so on any platform where you find podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also subscribe on YouTube to the Ancient Philosophy Podcast channel. I have a Substack, Plato's fishtrap.substack.com. I also have a book available for purchase, which is called An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which you can buy wherever you buy books, such as on Amazon, or you can buy directly through the publisher, which is Hackett. Until next time, I'm Doug Campbell, and this has been the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. Thank you very much.